Automotive Singer, Biology and Medicine videos, please make sure to subscribe. Join the forum and group for the latest videos. Please visit Facebook Automotive Singer and please like here. In this video, we're going to talk about the endocrine system. Now, the endocrine system main purpose is to maintain a homeostatic environment through the use of hormones. So when we think of the endocrine system, we should think of hormones. Hormones are essentially signaling molecules. Now, the endocrine system works in close proximity with the nervous system, in that both the endocrine system and the nervous system tries to maintain a homeostatic environment by sending out signals. The main difference between the two is that the nervous system is a quick response. So when a stimulus arrives at a neuron, the neuron can pass on these signals, these commands, as neurotransmitters that will then target a particular cell. The neurotransmitter will bind onto a specific receptor that will cause the target cell to initiate a short-term, quick response. Now, the endocrine system, on the other hand, will send signals not via neurotransmitters but through hormones. And these hormones will travel via the bloodstream, where it will then target a cell and its specific receptors. So what happens is, with an endocrine cell, is that when a stimulus or command comes, this will stimulate the endocrine cell to secrete hormones into the bloodstream, like so. These hormones will then target and bind onto a specific receptor on a target cell. This will cause a target cell to initiate a long-term, slow response. So that is a major difference, in that the nervous system is a short-term, quick response, whereas the endocrine system is a long-term, slow response. The endocrine cell typically secrete hormones into the bloodstream. This is normal. This type of signaling is called endocrine signaling, hence the name endocrine system. However, hormones does not always have to be secreted into the bloodstream to target a cell. The endocrine cell can also secrete hormones that target cell directly close to it, like this cell, for example. And so when it does this, this type of secretion is known as paracrine signaling, para as in across. And this will initiate a long-term slow response. When the endocrine cell secretes hormones into the bloodstream, which is the basics for the endocrine system, we have hormones in the bloodstream. The hormones can travel in the bloodstream as a free form, which can be cleared quickly by the body. Free form as in it's just a hormone traveling in the blood. Or the hormone can actually travel bound to a protein. These hormones that are bound to a protein and travel through the blood are typically lipid hormones, because lipids hate water. They need to travel bound to proteins. We call these protein-bound hormones. So now let's talk a little bit more about hormones. Hormones, as I mentioned, are signaling molecules. Hormones can be grouped into three types: amino acid derivatives, peptide hormones, or lipid derivatives. Lipid derivatives, for example, are steroid hormones or thyroid hormones, if you know a little bit about your hormones. And so these hormones, they will bind onto a target cell, onto the specific receptor, that will initiate a desired response, a long-term response. Here I'm drawing these hormones binding onto target receptors on this plasma membrane of the target cell to initiate a response. Well, peptide hormones and most hormones derived from amino acid, they bind to receptors on the plasma membrane. Whereas the lipid-derived hormones, they cross the cell membrane and bind to receptors in the cytoplasm, as shown. Thyroid hormones and steroid hormones, they cross the plasma membrane and bind to receptors in the cytoplasm to initiate a response. And this is because the thyroid and steroid hormones are lipid-derived. Okay, now that we know a bit more about hormones, these signaling molecules, let's look at an example of an endocrine response. A good example is to look at blood glucose. So here in the bloodstream, we have low glucose levels. And this is not very good because we need glucose. Glucose is a source of energy for tissues in our body. So low blood glucose is a stimulus. And the body will have to try to fix this to maintain homeostasis. So it will try to increase blood glucose levels. And this is when the endocrine system kicks in. The stimulus, which is low blood glucose levels, will stimulate an endocrine cell, known as the pancreas cell. Actually, it's called the alpha cell, but let's call it pancreas cells for simplicity. The pancreas cell will then secrete a hormone called glucagon into the bloodstream. Glucagon will travel through the bloodstream to the liver, which is the target cell. Glucagon is not a lipid hormone because 1, it is not bound to a protein when it travels through the blood, and 2, it binds to receptors on the cell membrane. When glucagon binds to the receptors on the liver cell, glucagon will stimulate the liver to break down glycogen to secrete glucose in the blood. And so the response by this liver cell is that it will secrete more glucose in the blood, which will increase blood glucose levels, like so. All these glucose is being secreted out. When blood glucose level is increasing, this will send a feedback back. It will send a feedback. It will send a negative feedback signal to stop stimulating the pancreas cell. Because when you have normal to high blood glucose levels, you don't need you don't have low blood glucose stimulation, and you don't need any more glucose to be secreted. I hope you understand this concept of negative feedback. So in the example we just saw, we looked at the hormone called glucagon, which is secreted by the alpha cells of the pancreas. Now let's look at some other major hormones, such as glucagon, and where they come from. We will not look at what they do, well, I'll try to mention them, but we'll just look at what they are. Before we continue, we should know that we have many hormones in the body that perform different functions or have different responses. Another terminology to learn is also what's called endocrine glands. Endocrine glands are essentially groups of endocrine cells that are dedicated to perform a specific function. So let's look at the first 2 or 3 most important endocrine glands, I think. The first is situated in the brain here. The first one is known as the hypothalamus, and this is an endocrine tissue. And the hypothalamus is responsible for the production of antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin. It is also responsible for the production of the regulatory hormones. And we will look at what these do. Probably the most important endocrine glands are the pituitary glands, which are located right below the hypothalamus here. And there are 2 lobes of the pituitary glands. There is the anterior lobe and the posterior lobe. The posterior lobe secretes oxytocin and antidiuretic hormones that were produced by the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus produces these hormones and sends them to the posterior lobe, which then the posterior lobe will secrete it into the blood. The anterior lobe of the pituitary glands actually secrete many hormones, including ACTH, which stands for adrenocorticotropin hormone, TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone, obviously stimulates the thyroid, GH, growth hormone for growth, PRL, prolactin for milk production in the breast, and then FSH, which is follicle stimulating hormone, and LH, luteinizing hormone, which are responsible for the reproductive system. So these hormones that are secreted by the anterior lobe, they are regulated by the hormones from the hypothalamus. So if you remember, the hypothalamus secretes regulatory hormones that regulates the secretion of the anterior hormones, if that makes any sense. There's another endocrine gland in the brain known as a pineal gland, which is around this area, and it secretes melatonin. Melatonin is actually responsible for the body clock. Now let's make our way down. In the trachea, our throat area, we have, wrapping around the trachea, we have the thyroid gland. Now the thyroid gland secretes few hormones, thyroxine, which is abbreviated T4, and triiodothyronine, which is T3. It's responsible for metabolism essentially. Then you have calcitonin. Now, the thyroid gland, it also has other endocrine glands on it. So if we zoom into this area here, we're looking at this person from a posterior point of view, from the back. So we have the thyroid gland, and then we have these four sort of lobes on the thyroid gland. These are known as the parathyroid gland. Para isn't a cross, but it's just on it. So there are four parathyroid glands, and these are behind the thyroid gland, and they secrete the hormone parathyroid hormone. Simple enough. Parathyroid hormone is important in the regulation of calcium and phosphate in our blood, in our body. Now, right below the thyroid gland, we have another endocrine gland, you can say, known as the thymus. Now, the thymus is not really a big deal in the endocrine world, but it is a big deal in the immune system world. But in the endocrine world, the thymus actually undergoes atrophy during adulthood, and it begins secreting thymosin. Of course, in this person we have the lungs connected to the trachea and the heart between the lungs. Now, if you didn't know, the heart is also classified as an endocrine gland because it secretes hormones. The heart secretes the hormone natriuretic peptide, which is responsible in blood pressure regulation. It actually decreases blood pressure when there is an increase in blood pressure. Then we have the digestive tract. Now the digestive tract, they secrete a variety of hormones. And what I mean by the digestive tract, I mean the stomach, the duodenum, the small intestines, etc. And they produce many hormones such as gastrin, somatostatin, cholecystokinin, etc. Another very important endocrine gland or tissue is the pancreas. And it secretes two main hormones, insulin and glucagon. Now we talked about glucagon in that it increases blood glucose levels. Well, insulin works opposite. It decreases blood glucose levels. And you might know diabetes people, they have very low insulin levels. Well, type 2 diabetes, they have low insulin levels, or type 1, they have depleted insulin levels. And so you have very high blood glucose levels, and you can't decrease this because you have no insulin. And if you wait until the end of the video, I will provide links to some of these hormones so you can watch them in more detail and see what they do. The kidneys also secrete hormones. They secrete erythropoietin, which stimulates red blood cell production in the bone marrow, and also secretes calcitriol, which I don't know what it does. Above the kidneys, we also have the very important adrenal glands. If we take a cross-section of the adrenal glands, we have two adrenal glands, of course, because we have two kidneys. If we cut a cross-section of the adrenal glands, we have the adrenal cortex, the outer part of the adrenal glands, and then we have the adrenal medulla, the middle of the adrenal glands. And this line I'm drawing for the adrenal medulla, it's meant to be in the middle of the adrenal glands, not on the outside. It's a mistake. Anyway, the adrenal cortex secretes cortisol and aldosterone. Cortisol is essentially for stress, and aldosterone is to promote sodium reabsorption as well as potassium secretion in the kidneys. And then we have the adrenal medulla, which secretes adrenaline and noradrenaline, also known as epinephrine or norepinephrine in America. These hormones are important in the fight or flight response as well as the rest and digest response. Adipose tissue, which is essentially fat, also secrete hormones. It secretes leptin, which is important in fat metabolism. The final endocrine tissue or endocrine glands I want to talk about are the gonads. Now, because we have a male and female version of humans, we have two types of gonads. We have the testes for the male and the ovaries for females. So in the testes we have cells that secrete androgens such as testosterone, which is important for promoting male characteristics as well as sperm production. And then we have for the gonads, the ovaries, for the female, we have important hormones being secreted such as estrogen and progesterone, which is important in female characteristics and egg production. Okay, so those were the main hormones that were secreted by the main endocrine tissue or endocrine glands. But I'd like to concentrate and look into more detail on the pituitary glands, which is a very important endocrine gland because it, for one, secretes a lot of hormones, and two, it secretes hormones that regulate or stimulate the secretion of other hormones from other endocrine tissue, if that makes any sense. So let's have a closer look at the pituitary glands. The pituitary glands is located within the brain, and an easy way to remember this is it's located sort of below the hypothalamus. The pituitary glands consist of two lobes. One is called the posterior pituitary, which is at the back. It's also known as a neurohypophyses. And then we have the anterior pituitary, also known as the adenohypophyses. I hope I'm pronouncing the physes right. Anyway, let's first look at the posterior pituitary and what it secretes. Well, actually, the hypothalamus, it synthesizes antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin. These hormones that are synthesized in the hypothalamus, they are synthesized in these neurons, and these neurons will then pass on these hormones to the posterior pituitary. And so from here, when a stimulus arrives, stimulating the secretion of these hormones, the posterior pituitary can then secrete it. So the posterior pituitary can secrete the antidiuretic hormone. The antidiuretic hormone's main function is for water retention, so it targets the kidneys, particularly the kidney tubules. The posterior pituitary can also secrete the hormone oxytocin. Oxytocin essentially targets the breast, and it's important for lactation, and also is important for the contraction of the uterus during childbirth. So remember, for the posterior pituitary, the hormones itself are actually synthesized or made within the hypothalamus. The posterior pituitary only secretes them. Now let's look at the anterior pituitary. Now the anterior pituitary is different than the posterior pituitary in that the anterior pituitary makes its own hormones. However, these hormones, most of them can only be secreted when there is some form of confirmation from the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus actually will secrete hormones that will regulate the secretion of the anterior pituitary hormones. The hormones secreted by the hypothalamus are known as regulatory hormones, and these regulatory hormones, once they are secreted, they will cause either stimulation or inhibition of the anterior pituitary hormones being secreted. Anyway, whatever the case, if it's all okay, the anterior pituitary can secrete prolactin, abbreviated PRL, which will target the breasts, essentially for milk production. Anterior pituitary can also secrete growth hormones, which targets many tissues, such as the bone, for growth. The anterior pituitary can secrete gonadotropic hormones, such as follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone, which will target the testes or ovaries, depending if it's male or female. Anterior pituitary can also secrete thyroid-stimulating hormone, which will stimulate the thyroid gland to secrete its own hormones. And finally, the anterior pituitary can also secrete adenocorticotropic hormone, which will target the adrenal glands, and it will stimulate the release of cortisol, etc., for example. So as you can see, the pituitary glands secrete a variety of hormones, and they're controlled in a very confusing manner. And I'll provide actually a video that will look more into detail on the pituitary glands. Actually, I'll provide links hopefully to many of these hormones, so you can click on the link on the screen and they'll take you to this video so you can watch it in a bit more detail. Thank you.